Plays were not always associated with the kind of high art or high culture that we tend to associate them with now. In early modern London, London during the Renaissance, plays were a very different kind of cultural event, a very different kind of entertainment than how we tend to think of them in present day America. So when we're talking about early modern London theater, we're specifically thinking in terms of 1576 to 1642, because in 1576, the first purpose built theater, permanent structure meant for performing plays, the theater, was completed. And in 1642, an act of parliament closed down all of the theaters in London, and they were all torn down shortly after. So here you can see the locations around London of the various theaters. We should notice here that there are several on the south bank of the Thames, including the Rose, the Globe, the Hope. And then you see above London, north of this wall, we've got the Theatre, the Curtain, the Fortune. So this wall is what separated London proper from the suburbs. The authorities in London didn't like players and plays. They wanted to shut them down, get them out of the city. And so within the city walls, within London proper, the playhouses that you see are actually guild halls, like Draper's Hall, Merchant Taylor's Hall. Those are guild halls where guilds would put on performances. There's also some inns that are included in the Inns at Court, where plays were performed. And then there are schools or indoor theaters like St. Paul's and the Blackfriars and the Greyfriars. Those were in what we now think of as liberties. They were areas within London that, because of their monastic past, were sort of free from the same authority and jurisdiction as the rest of London. So these were the places where performances took place. This is where the theaters were built, because theater was not considered an established, respectable form of art. Instead, it was a form of popular entertainment that many people thought of as being dangerous and at risk of corrupting the youth. So one of Christopher Marlowe's contemporaries famously referred to him as a poet and a filthy playmaker. And it's not because he wrote filthy plays, although somebody could argue that, but it's because playmaking or playwriting was considered a filthy occupation. Being a poet was something that was established, it was appreciated as an art form in a way that plays weren't. And so we have as the two main companies that form in London in the 1590s, the Lord Chamberlain's Men and the Lord Admiral's Men. So these were the two companies that had high standing patrons. Other companies did too, but then in the late 1590s, the Privy Council passed a resolution that made these the two sort of companies that were licensed to perform in London, the two professional playing companies. There were still boys' companies around putting on performances, and perhaps some traveling companies that came into the city and performed from time to time as well. But the two main companies throughout the late 16th century, early 17th century, are these two. And their patrons, the Lord Chamberlain and the Lord Admiral, were aristocrats that basically provided a kind of protection for the company. The livery of these patrons, or the sort of servant's uniform, is what the actors, the players in the company would wear. And so they were technically considered servants to the Lord Chamberlain or servants to the Lord Admiral. And this gave them a little bit of protection and a respectable standing in London society respectable enough that they could um, avoid being sort of kicked out by the Puritan authorities that were trying to drive them out of London. The irony of this system is that playwrights, players, as actors in the period, in these acting companies, they did not have most of their income come from patrons. Most of their income was coming from the public performances that they were doing 6 days a week. So they officially had patrons that offered them a little bit of protection within society, but in fact, most of their income wasn't coming from a patron at all. It was instead coming from the masses that would go to see plays, and some of their income was coming from performances at court, where they were invited to perform during various religious holidays. And the shareholders were the main core of actors within a company. So the shareholders, usually for most companies, it would be around 10, and they would have shares in the company so that when a playing company performed, their income for that day's performance would be mainly divided up between the shareholders. Now, they would also have to hire some um, more itinerant players to do sort of smaller roles, perhaps, and often there were women's roles being performed by boys who were apprenticed to shareholders. So the shareholders themselves, the sharers, were the main actors in the company, and their apprentices would be these teenage boys who would play the women's roles. So here you see an image from a reconstruction of the Globe called Shakespeare's Globe in London. And you can see here the kind of layout of the stage, um, where the exits and entrances would take place, the reveal space. You've got the two columns here. And notice all of the people standing around the stage, the groundlings, how close they are, how close they would be to actors on the stage. Here you see from a different angle the same performance, and you can see this rope dangling down from the heavens, the space above the stage. And so there were pulleys and different mechanisms within the heavens that would allow for gods or goddesses or other sort of mythical creatures to descend from the heavens. Similarly, there was a trap door in the floor that would allow um, people or creatures to ascend from hell, or characters could have to go down into hell or into purgatory by exiting through the trapdoor. This is a reconstruction of an indoor theater, the Blackfriars Theater, and this particular reconstruction is in Staunton, Virginia. You see here we've got a very similar layout because the same plays would be performed at both indoor and outdoor theaters. So you've got the two doors for exits and entrances, you've got the reveal space, you have this above space, you've got audience members, in this case sitting on three sides of the stage, and you have audience members who would be sitting on these stools on the stage itself. So the most expensive seats in the Blackfriars or any other indoor theater would be these stools that were actually on stage that would put aristocrats sort of in the middle of the action. And sometimes they would be sort of pulled into a performance in various ways. This is another reconstruction of the Blackfriars. This is the Sam Wanamaker Theater in London that's right next to Shakespeare's Globe. And you see here again the same kind of basic layout in terms of doors and performance spaces. The main difference between these two reconstructions is that the Wanamaker Theater is actually able to do candlelight performances with real candles. So we have a really good sense of what it would cost to see a performance at the Globe, and we could think of this as being similar to other outdoor theaters like the Rose or the Fortune. It would be a penny to go in to the theater to see a play. You could theoretically go and only spend a penny, and that would allow you to be a groundling standing around the stage. Or if you wanted a seat, you could spend an extra penny, and if you wanted a seat higher up in one of the second or third tier seats, you could spend an additional penny for each floor that you went up. Or you could spend sixpence, and that would allow you to sit in the Lord's box, which we think was probably the above space, or at least part of the above space above the stage. So the Lord's box, most expensive seats in the house, 6 times the amount to simply get into the theater, but still not a terribly large amount of money. You wouldn't necessarily just have aristocrats spending this amount to sit there, although those would be the most likely people to have that much disposable income. This is a diagram of the Globe. You see here very, very similar to the first image that I showed from the reconstructed Shakespeare's Globe. This diagram is helpful, though, because it also gives you a sense of the tiers of seats and where the stairwells were that would take you to the higher up tiers. So we know that the audience consisted of people from various classes. Anyone who, even as a day laborer or an apprentice who made very little money, could still afford to go see a play if they just wanted to be a groundling and go. People with more wealth would go to see the plays as well, would probably spend more money for a better seat. And the advantage of a seat like the ones in the Lord's box were that they were very, very visible to everyone else in the theater, to the rest of the audience. So sometimes people in the period would talk about going to hear a play rather than going to see a play. They used both terms, but what that draws our attention to, I think, is the kind of oral experience of the speeches that these actors would deliver as they're performing. And it also perhaps explains a little bit of why the Lord's box seats would be the most expensive, even though they wouldn't necessarily be the best seats to see the performance. The groundlings probably got a better view, but anyone in the Lord's box would have been able to hear better. And we do know that performances were said to have lasted 2 to 3 hours, or perhaps at least at times as long as 6. Now that wouldn't be one play taking 6 hours. It would be a 2 to 3 hour play, perhaps in the middle of a 6-hour period of entertainment. So people would sometimes go to the theater very early, and there were perhaps other types of entertainment being performed, juggling, dances, sort of stand-up comedy. Similarly, after a play, there might be such entertainments as well. And one way we can think of this in significance to the plays that we read now is that at the end of any play in the early modern period, the actors, the players, would dance a jig at the end of the play. And a jig is a very sort of upbeat, high-energy kind of dance. So even at the end of a tragedy, where you might have bodies strewn all over the stage, you would immediately after the play ended have all of the players stand up and start to perform a jig. So it'd be a very, what we would now think of as a kind of funny, entertaining performance that might come immediately after a very somber scene in the play that you'd been watching. The Master of the Revels was the person responsible for licensing plays. When Queen Elizabeth or later King James would have entertainments as part of the celebration of various religious holidays, the Master of the Revels was the one who arranged for those entertainments. Plays were especially important to the companies that performed them in London because being invited to perform for the court meant that you would get a lot more money for just that one performance than what you would normally make because it's coming directly from the crown. The Master of the Revels would also, when he would go to license a play, read through it looking for certain kind of material that ultimately he would want censored out of it. He would send it back, perhaps requesting that certain lines or speeches or an entire scene be cut. And generally, the types of speeches or scenes he was on the lookout for would be anything too sort of contemporary, too recent in terms of international affairs. He wouldn't want any of the foreign ambassadors who we know went to see plays even in the public theaters. He wouldn't want them getting upset enough that he would go complain to somebody and raise an uproar about it. Similarly, we know that sometimes there would be enough sort of apprentices or laborers in a theater, and if something went wrong, if a performance got canceled, sometimes having all those people in a small space led to riots. And so the Master of the Revels was specifically looking for material that might encourage that. Anything like a riot or a revolution on stage, he would normally want taken out so that it wouldn't encourage actual people in the audience to start a riot. So I mentioned before that the apprentices were these teenage boys who would play all the women's roles. The professional acting companies had these apprentices, played all the women's roles. Then there were also these boys' companies that were all teenage boys, ostensibly members of a choir, perhaps, that they would put on performances as well, sometimes of the same plays that were performed by the professional companies, the adult companies. And here I've got a short list of just some of the playwrights and players that were members of certain guilds. You see on here the King's Men. This is the Lord Chamberlain's men, in 1603 became the King's Men. And we've got some records that have survived that have shed light on particularly John Hemminge's apprentices, where he would have one or two apprentices at a time. And we know that although these were technically boys who were apprenticing to be grocers, they were in fact the boy actors in the company. And that's really why we ended up with an early modern London theater that had no women on stage. It's not necessarily because of sort of cultural misogyny, although that certainly was an issue too. But the reason why the theaters developed the way that they did, the reason why these companies established themselves as a sort of boys-only club, was because they were trying to get established in opposition to people, powerful people, who wanted to drive them out of the city and keep them out of the city. And so one of the ways they did that was by following the guild model, so that even though there was no players guild, there were enough of the players were members of other guilds that they went along with that model to help get established, and guilds in the period didn't allow women in them.